The sun hung like a burning coin in the endless blue sky above the Arizona desert. Sam Harrison wiped the sweat from his weathered face with the back of his hand, leaving a streak of dust across his forehead. At 32, he had spent more years under this merciless sun than most men twice his age. His calloused hands gripped the reins of his horse, Thunder, a sturdy brown Mustang that had been his companion through countless miles of desert terrain. Sam was not like the other cowboys who worked the ranches scattered across this harsh landscape. While they spent their evenings drinking whiskey and playing cards in the saloons of nearby towns, Sam preferred the solitude of the desert. There was something about the vast emptiness that spoke to his soul, something about the way the wind carried stories across the sand dunes that made him feel connected to something larger than himself. The Harrison Ranch stretched across 5,000 acres of desert land that his father had claimed 20 years earlier. It was not the most fertile ground, but it was home to Sam and his younger sister, Mary. Their parents had died in a cholera outbreak when Sam was 18 and Mary was only 12. Since then, Sam had raised Mary while trying to keep the ranch running with the help of 3 Mexican workers who had become more like family than employees. On this particular morning, Sam was riding the eastern boundary of his property, checking the fence lines and looking for signs of cattle rustlers who had been plaguing the area for months. The desert was deceptively quiet, with only the sound of Thunder's hooves hitting the hard-packed earth and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. As he crested a small hill, Sam noticed something unusual in the distance. Smoke was rising from what appeared to be a small camp near a cluster of ancient rocks that the local Apache people considered sacred. Sam had always maintained peaceful relations with the Apache tribes in the area. Unlike many of his neighbors who viewed the Apache as nothing more than hostile savages, Sam understood that they were simply trying to protect their ancestral lands from the flood of white settlers moving west. He guided Thunder down the slope toward the smoke, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the handle of his Colt revolver. Not out of fear, but out of caution that had been bred into him by years of living on the frontier. As he drew closer, he could make out several figures moving around what appeared to be a makeshift shelter constructed from branches and animal hides. When he was about 50 yards away, Sam called out in the broken Apache language he had learned from an old medicine man who sometimes traded with the ranchers in the area. "I come in peace," he shouted, raising his hand to show he meant no harm. 3 figures emerged from behind the shelter. They were Apache women, but something about them seemed different from the Apache people Sam had encountered before. 2 appeared to be young, perhaps in their late teens, while the third was clearly older, maybe in her 40s. But it was not their age that struck Sam as unusual. It was the intricate markings that covered their faces and arms. The markings were unlike anything Sam had seen before. They were not the typical war paint that Apache warriors wore into battle, nor were they the ceremonial decorations he had observed during the few tribal gatherings he had been permitted to witness. These markings seemed to tell a story, with symbols that appeared to flow from one into another like a written language painted directly onto their skin. The older woman stepped forward, and Sam could see that her face bore the most elaborate markings of all. Spirals and geometric patterns covered her cheeks and forehead, extending down her neck and disappearing beneath the simple leather dress she wore. Her eyes, despite being surrounded by the strange symbols, were kind and intelligent. She spoke in accented but clear English. "You are the cowboy from the Harrison Ranch," she said. It was not a question but a statement, as if she had been expecting him. Sam nodded, dismounting from Thunder but keeping the reins in his hand. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Sam Harrison. I saw your smoke and wanted to make sure everything was all right." The woman smiled, and Sam noticed that even her smile seemed to be enhanced by the markings around her mouth. "My name is Ayana. These are my daughters, Kaya and Senna." She gestured to the 2 younger women, who stepped forward slightly but remained cautious. "We have heard of you, Sam Harrison," Ayana continued. "The Apache people speak of the white cowboy who treats our people with respect, who does not shoot first and ask questions later like so many others." Sam felt a warmth spread through his chest at her words. He had always tried to live by the principles his father had taught him before his death: treat all people with dignity, regardless of the color of their skin or the customs they followed. "What brings you to this place?" Sam asked, genuinely curious. He knew that this particular area of the desert was not commonly used by any of the local Apache bands, and the presence of 3 women traveling alone was highly unusual. Ayana's expression grew serious, and she exchanged glances with her daughters before answering. "We are not from the Apache bands that live in these lands. We have traveled many days from the mountains to the east, following signs that were given to us in dreams and visions." She paused, studying Sam's face as if trying to determine whether he would understand what she was about to tell him. "The markings you see on our faces and bodies are not decorations, Sam Harrison. They are a form of protection, a way of speaking to the spirits that watch over the boundary between life and death." Sam had heard stories of Apache medicine women who possessed unusual powers, but he had always assumed they were just frontier tall tales. However, looking at Ayana and her daughters, he found himself believing that there might be more to their presence in this desolate place than simple coincidence. "We are what your people might call healers," Kaya, the elder of the 2 daughters, spoke for the first time. Her voice was soft but carried a strength that reminded Sam of his own sister Mary. "But we do more than heal the body. We help guide souls that have become lost between this world and the next." Senna, who appeared to be the younger daughter, added, "The markings are a map, written in the old language that speaks to the spirits. Each symbol has meaning, each line tells part of the story of our purpose." Sam found himself fascinated by these women and their mysterious markings. He had always been drawn to people who were different, who saw the world through eyes unclouded by the prejudices and limitations that seemed to plague so many of his contemporaries. "What kind of signs brought you here?" he asked, settling down on a nearby rock to show that he was willing to listen to their story. Ayana sat across from him, her daughters flanking her on either side. The markings on her face seemed to shift and change in the flickering light of their small fire, as if they were alive with their own energy. "For 3 moons, we have been having the same vision," she began, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of a storyteller. "In this vision, we see a great darkness spreading across the desert, a sickness that affects not just the body but the spirit itself. We see men dying not from bullets or disease, but from something that steals their will to live." She pointed toward the west, where the town of Copper Creek lay about 20 miles away. "The vision shows us that this darkness will come from the direction of the white man's settlement, and that many will die unless the proper ceremonies are performed to turn the darkness away." Sam felt a chill run down his spine despite the desert heat. He had heard rumors from Copper Creek about a strange malaise that had been affecting some of the townspeople. Men were falling into deep depressions, becoming violent or simply lying down and refusing to get up. The town doctor had been baffled by the condition, unable to find any physical cause for the affliction. "You think there's something supernatural causing the problems in Copper Creek?" Sam asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of his voice. Kaya nodded solemnly. "In our traditions, there are times when the balance between the physical world and the spirit world becomes disturbed. When this happens, negative energies can seep through and affect the living. The markings we wear are a form of spiritual armor, protecting us as we work to restore the balance." Senna added, "We have been traveling from place to place, following the signs and performing the ceremonies needed to heal the spiritual wounds that have been opened. But this darkness we have seen in our visions is stronger than any we have encountered before." Sam thought about the stories he had heard from Copper Creek, about good men suddenly turning violent or simply losing the will to continue living. He thought about his own sister Mary, who had been complaining of strange dreams and feelings of unease over the past few weeks. Could there be a connection between her distress and whatever was happening in the town? "What do you need to do to stop this darkness?" he asked, surprised to find that he was taking their story seriously. Ayana stood up and walked to their makeshift shelter, returning with a leather pouch that she handled with obvious reverence. "The ceremony requires specific sacred items and must be performed at a place of power. These markings," she traced one of the symbols on her forehead with her finger, "will guide us to the right location and protect us during the ritual." She opened the pouch and showed Sam its contents, various herbs, small carved stones, and what appeared to be a piece of meteorite that gleamed with an unusual iridescent quality. "But we will also need the help of someone from the white world," Kaya said, looking directly at Sam. "The visions show us that the darkness has been caused, at least in part, by actions taken by white men who did not understand the spiritual consequences of their deeds. To heal the wound, we need someone from that world to stand with us. Sam felt the weight of their expectations settling on his shoulders. He was just a rancher, a man who understood cattle and horses and the practical challenges of making a living in the desert. What did he know about spiritual ceremonies and battles between good and evil? But, as he looked at the three women sitting before him, their faces marked with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, he found himself remembering his father's words, "Sometimes, son, life calls on us to be more than what we think we are. When that happens, you don't ask questions. You just step up and do what needs to be done." "What exactly would you need me to do?" Sam asked, his decision already made even before he heard their answer. Ayanna smiled, and Sam could see relief flood across her face. "The ceremony must be performed at sunset on the night of the new moon, which is 3 days from now. You would need to stand with us in the circle of power, lending your strength to our efforts to turn the darkness away." Senna added, "It will not be without danger. The negative energies will fight back, trying to prevent us from completing the ceremony. There may be physical manifestations, things that will try to frighten us or distract us from our purpose. But the markings will protect us," Kaya assured him. "And your presence will help anchor the ceremony in both worlds, giving us the power we need to succeed." Sam looked out across the desert toward the direction of Copper Creek, thinking about the people there who might be suffering from this mysterious affliction. He thought about Mary and her recent trouble sleeping, her complaints of feeling like something was watching her. If there was even a chance that these women could help, he had to try. "Where do we need to perform this ceremony?" he asked. Ayanna pointed toward a distant mesa that rose from the desert floor like an ancient monument. "There, at the place your people call Devil's Table. It is a place where the barrier between worlds has always been thin, where the spirits gather to watch over the desert." Sam knew the place. It was a flat-topped mountain about 10 miles from his ranch, surrounded by legends and stories that kept most people away. Some said it was cursed, others claimed it was sacred. Now it seemed that both might be true. "I'll need to go back to my ranch and make arrangements," Sam said, standing up and brushing the dust from his pants. "My sister Mary has been having some troubles lately, and I want to make sure she's safe while I'm gone." Ayanna nodded understandingly. "Bring her with you," she said unexpectedly. "The visions show us that a young woman with pure intentions must also be present for the ceremony to succeed. If she is willing, she could be the final piece we need." Sam hesitated. The idea of bringing Mary into what could be a dangerous situation made his protective instincts flare. But then, he remembered how troubled she had been lately, how she had been complaining of feeling like something dark was pressing down on her spirit. "I'll talk to her," he said finally. "If she's willing to come, I'll bring her. If not, we'll find another way." As Sam mounted Thunder and prepared to ride back to his ranch, Ayanna called out to him. "Sam Harrison, you should know that by agreeing to help us, you are changing your destiny. After the ceremony, your life will never be the same. The spirits will know you, and they will call on you again when the need arises." Sam touched the brim of his hat in farewell. "Ma'am, my life changed the day I decided to treat all people with respect, regardless of their differences. If the spirits want to call on me to help heal the world, then I reckon I'm ready to answer." As he rode away from their camp, Sam could feel the eyes of the 3 Apache women watching him go. The markings on their faces seemed to have burned themselves into his memory, and he found himself wondering what it would feel like to bear such symbols, to carry the responsibility of standing between the world of the living and whatever dark forces threatened to consume it. The ride back to his ranch gave Sam time to think about what he had committed himself to. Part of him wondered if he was making a terrible mistake, getting involved in something he didn't understand. But a larger part of him felt a sense of rightness about his decision, as if this meeting with Ayanna and her daughters had been destined to happen. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of red and gold, Sam found himself looking forward to the conversation he would have with Mary. His sister had always been more intuitive than he was, more sensitive to the subtle currents that flowed beneath the surface of everyday life. If anyone could understand the importance of what he was being asked to do, it would be Mary. Thunder's hooves carried him steadily across the familiar terrain toward home, toward a conversation that would determine whether he would face the coming ceremony alone or with the support of the person he cared about most in the world. Behind him, smoke continued to rise from the Apache women's camp, a thin column reaching up toward the darkening sky like a prayer made visible. The desert wind carried the sound of distant thunder, though there were no clouds in the sky. Sam urged his horse to move faster, suddenly, eager to reach the safety of his ranch and the warm light of Mary's smile. Tomorrow, he would begin preparing for what might be the most important 3 days of his life. The Harrison ranch house stood silhouetted against the evening sky like a beacon of civilization in the vast desert wilderness. Sam could see the warm yellow glow of lamplight spilling from the windows, and smoke rising from the chimney where Mary was probably preparing their evening meal. As Thunder's hooves clattered across the wooden bridge that spanned the dry creek bed marking the edge of their property, Sam felt the familiar sense of homecoming that never failed to comfort him after a long day on the range. But, tonight, that comfort was tinged with anxiety about the conversation he was about to have with his sister. How do you tell someone you care about that you've agreed to participate in an Apache ritual designed to combat supernatural darkness? How do you explain that mysterious markings on 3 women's faces had convinced you to risk your life in a ceremony you didn't fully understand? Sam unsaddled Thunder in the stable and made sure the horse had plenty of feed and water before walking across the dusty yard to the house. The familiar smell of Mary's cornbread drifted through the evening air, mixing with the desert scents of sage and creosote. For a moment, Sam allowed himself to imagine that this was just another ordinary evening, that he would sit down to dinner with his sister and they would talk about the mundane concerns of ranch life. But, as he climbed the wooden steps to the front porch, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Scratched into the dust near the door were symbols that looked remarkably similar to some of the markings he had seen on Ayana's face. They appeared fresh, as if they had been drawn recently, but Sam couldn't imagine who might have made them. He pushed open the front door and called out, "Mary, I'm home." "Sam!" Mary's voice carried relief and something else, a tension that he had been hearing in her voice more and more over the past few weeks. "Thank goodness you're back. I've been having the strangest day." Sam found his sister in the kitchen, stirring a pot of stew that filled the small room with the aroma of beef and vegetables. Mary Harrison was 26 years old, with the kind of natural beauty that came from a life spent in clean air and honest work. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her blue eyes sparkled with the intelligence that had made her one of the most sought-after young women in the territory. But, tonight, those eyes held shadows that worried Sam. Dark circles beneath them suggested that she hadn't been sleeping well, and there was a nervous energy in her movements that spoke of barely controlled anxiety. "What kind of strange day?" Sam asked, hanging his hat on the peg by the door and settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. Mary ladled stew into 2 bowls and brought them to the table along with a plate of her fresh cornbread. "It started this morning, right after you left. I was hanging laundry on the line when I heard voices coming from the direction of the old Indian burial ground." Sam knew the place she was talking about. It was a small hill about a mile from the ranch house where, according to local Apache tradition, several important tribal leaders had been laid to rest generations ago. Most of the white settlers avoided the area, partly out of respect and partly out of superstition. "What kind of voices?" Sam asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "Women's voices, speaking in a language I didn't recognize," Mary said, sitting down across from him. "But, Sam, the strange thing was that even though I couldn't understand the words, I somehow knew what they were saying. They were calling to me, asking me to come to them." Sam felt his pulse quicken. "Did you go?" Mary shook her head. "I wanted to. I felt this incredible pull, like something was drawing me toward that hill. But, every time I started walking in that direction, I would see these symbols appearing in the dust at my feet." She gestured toward the door. "Like the ones on the porch that I drew this afternoon." "You drew those symbols?" Sam asked, trying to keep the amazement out of his voice. "I don't know why," Mary admitted, looking down at her hands. "I was sitting on the porch, feeling restless and anxious, when I suddenly had this overwhelming urge to draw in the dirt. My finger just started moving on its own, creating those patterns. I don't even remember thinking about what I was drawing." Sam reached across the table and took his sister's hand.
Mary, I need to tell you about something that happened to me today. Something that might explain what you've been experiencing." For the next hour, Sam told Mary about his encounter with Ayanna and her daughters. He described the markings on their faces, their story about the spiritual darkness threatening the area, and their request for help with a ceremony that could turn the darkness away. Mary listened in rapt attention, occasionally asking questions but mostly just absorbing the incredible story her brother was telling her. When Sam finished, Mary was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the symbols she had unconsciously scratched into the wooden tabletop while listening to his story. Finally, she looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of fear and determination. "They want me to come with you, don't they?" she said. "That's why I've been having these strange experiences. They've been calling to me, preparing me for something." Sam nodded reluctantly. Ayanna said that a young woman with pure intentions needed to be part of the ceremony for it to succeed. "But, Mary, I want you to know that you don't have to do this. If you say no, I'll find another way." Mary stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the desert landscape that had been their home for so many years. "Do you remember what Papa used to tell us about the desert, Sam? He said it was alive, that it had its own spirit and its own way of protecting the people who treated it with respect." "I remember," Sam said softly. "I think Papa would have understood what's happening here," Mary continued. "He always said that there were forces in this world beyond what most people could see or understand, and that sometimes those forces needed human beings to help them keep the balance." She turned back to face her brother, and Sam was struck by how much she looked like their mother in that moment. "I've been feeling like something terrible was going to happen, like a storm was building up that could destroy everything we care about. If there's a chance that this ceremony could prevent that, then I have to help." Sam felt a surge of pride at his sister's courage, mixed with fear for her safety. "Are you sure, Mary? There's no telling what we might face out there." Mary smiled, and, for the first time in weeks, the shadows seemed to lift from her eyes. "I'm sure, Sam. Besides, those women didn't come all this way just to ask for our help. They came because they knew we were the right people for this task. I can feel it in my bones, we're supposed to do this." That night, after they had finished dinner and made plans for the next few days, Sam found himself unable to sleep. He lay in his bed listening to the desert wind whistling around the corners of the house, carrying with it sounds that seemed almost like whispered conversations in a language he couldn't understand. Around midnight, he gave up trying to sleep and walked out onto the front porch. The desert night was clear and cold, with a canopy of stars that stretched from horizon to horizon. In the distance, he could see the dark silhouette of Devil's Table, the mesa where they would perform the ceremony in 2 more days. As he stood there contemplating what lay ahead, Sam became aware that he was not alone. A figure was walking toward the house from the direction of the old burial ground, moving with a steady, purposeful gait that suggested familiarity with the terrain. Sam's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but, as the figure drew closer, he could see that it was Ayanna. The Apache woman's face was clearly visible in the starlight, the markings on her skin seeming to glow with their own faint luminescence. "Good evening, Sam Harrison," she said when she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. "I hope you do not mind that I have come to your home." "Not at all," Sam replied, though he was puzzled by her unexpected visit. "Is everything all right at your camp?" Ayanna smiled. "Our camp is safe. I have come because the spirits told me that your sister made her decision tonight, and that there are things she needs to know before the ceremony." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Mary appeared in the doorway behind Sam. She was wearing her nightgown and a shawl, but she showed no sign of surprise at seeing the Apache woman in their yard. "I've been expecting you," Mary said simply. "I saw you in a dream earlier tonight." Ayanna nodded approvingly. "You are already beginning to open your mind to the spirit world. That is good, it will make the preparation easier." She reached into a pouch she carried and withdrew what appeared to be a small pot of paint and a delicate brush made from animal hair. "Mary Harrison, if you are truly willing to participate in the ceremony, then you must be marked as we have been marked. The symbols will protect you and help you channel the energies we will need to succeed." Mary stepped forward without hesitation, and Sam watched in amazement as Ayanna began to paint intricate designs on his sister's face.
The symbols were different from those worn by the Apache woman, but they seemed to complement each other, as if they were different verses of the same spiritual song. As Ayana worked, she explained the meaning behind each mark. This symbol represents protection from negative energies, she said, painting a delicate spiral on Mary's forehead. This one opens your spiritual sight so that you can see beyond the physical world. A series of interconnected triangles appeared on Mary's left cheek. And this, Ayana said, adding a final symbol that looked like a stylized sun surrounded by rays, represents the power of pure intention to drive away darkness. When the markings were complete, Mary looked transformed. The symbols seemed to have awakened something in her, bringing out a strength and serenity that Sam had never seen before. She looked like what Sam imagined an ancient priestess might have looked like, powerful and mysterious but undeniably good. "How do you feel?" Ayana asked. Mary closed her eyes for a moment, as if taking inventory of some internal change. When she opened them, they seemed clearer and more focused than they had been in weeks. "I feel connected," she said. "Like I can sense things that were always there but that I never noticed before." Ayana nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Now you must both listen carefully, because there are things about the ceremony that I did not tell you before. The darkness we are fighting is not just some vague negative energy. It has a source, a focal point that gives it power." She pointed toward the direction of Copper Creek. 3 months ago, a group of prospectors found what they thought was a silver mine in the hills above the town. But what they actually found was something that should have been left undisturbed, a place where the Apache people once performed ceremonies to keep certain spirits locked away from the world of the living. Sam felt a chill run down his spine. "You're saying they accidentally released something that was supposed to stay buried?" "Not accidentally," Ayana said grimly. "They were warned by several members of the local Apache band to stay away from that place. But the white men ignored the warnings and began blasting with dynamite, destroying sacred barriers that had been maintained for generations." She looked back and forth between Sam and Mary, making sure they understood the gravity of what she was telling them. The entity that was released feeds on despair and violence. It whispers to people in their dreams, planting seeds of hopelessness and rage that grow until they consume the host completely. Mary gasped. "That's what I've been feeling. Like something was trying to get inside my thoughts, trying to make me believe that life wasn't worth living." "The markings I have given you will protect you from the entity's influence," Ayana assured her. "But, during the ceremony, we will be in direct confrontation with this creature. It will try everything in its power to prevent us from sending it back to the place where it belongs." Sam squared his shoulders. "What do we need to do?" Ayana reached into her pouch again and withdrew 2 items, a small knife with an ornate handle covered in symbols, and a piece of what looked like black volcanic glass that had been shaped into a perfect circle. "The ceremony requires a sacrifice," she said, and Sam's blood turned cold. "But not the kind of sacrifice you were thinking of," she added quickly, seeing the alarm on their faces. "Each participant must sacrifice something that represents their attachment to the physical world, something precious that they are willing to give up for the greater good." She handed the knife to Sam and the black glass circle to Mary. "These are tools that will help you focus your intentions during the ceremony. Sam, your sacrifice will be a drop of your blood, freely given to strengthen the barrier between worlds. Mary, you will break this obsidian mirror, symbolically shattering the illusions that allow darkness to masquerade as light." "What will you and your daughters sacrifice?" Mary asked. Ayana's expression grew solemn. "We will sacrifice our markings. When the ceremony is complete, the symbols that have protected us and given us power will fade away, leaving us as ordinary women. We will lose our ability to see into the spirit world, but the darkness will be banished." The weight of what they were being asked to do settled over Sam and Mary like a heavy blanket. These Apache women were willing to give up their supernatural abilities to save people they had never met, in a town that would probably never welcome them or show them gratitude. "There's one more thing you need to know," Ayana continued. "The entity we are fighting has been growing stronger by feeding on the fear and despair of the people in Copper Creek. By the time we perform the ceremony, it will be powerful enough to take physical form. We may not just be dealing with spiritual attacks,
There may be an actual creature that we have to face.
Sam thought about the stories he had heard from Copper Creek, about men turning violent without warning and women falling into catatonic states. If there really was some kind of supernatural predator stalking the town, then the ceremony they were planning might be the only thing standing between the entity and a much larger tragedy.
We understand, Sam said firmly. Tell us what we need to do to prepare.
For the next hour, Ayana instructed them in the basics of the protection ritual. She taught them specific words in the Apache language that would help focus their energy, showed them how to move in harmony with the natural rhythms of the desert, and explained the importance of maintaining absolute focus during the ceremony. As dawn began to break over the eastern horizon, Ayana prepared to leave.
Tomorrow night, you must both fast and spend the day in meditation, preparing your spirits for what is to come. At sunset on the following day, meet us at the base of Devil's Table. Bring nothing but the tools I have given you and the clothes on your backs. She paused at the edge of the yard and looked back at them. Sam and Mary Harrison, what you are about to do will be remembered by the spirits for generations to come. Your courage honors not just your own people, but all people who choose to stand against the darkness. As they watched her disappear into the pre-dawn gloom, Sam put his arm around his sister's shoulders. The markings on Mary's face seemed to pulse gently in the growing light, and Sam found himself thinking about how much their lives had changed in just 24 hours. "Are you scared?" he asked her quietly. Mary leaned against him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Terrified," she admitted. "But also excited. For the first time in weeks, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm meant to do." Sam nodded, understanding completely. Despite the danger they were facing, despite the uncertainty of what lay ahead, he felt the same sense of rightness that Mary had described. They were about to embark on something that would test every ounce of courage and faith they possessed, but they would face it together. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, brother and sister stood together on the porch of their family ranch, preparing for what might be their last normal day before everything changed forever. The day of fasting passed slowly for Sam and Mary Harrison. They spent the hours in quiet contemplation, each preparing for the ceremony in their own way. Sam found himself walking the boundaries of the ranch, memorizing every familiar landmark as if he might never see them again. Mary sat in meditation in the garden their mother had planted years ago, the markings on her face seeming to grow more vibrant as the day progressed. As evening approached, they prepared to ride out to Devil's Table. Sam saddled Thunder and their father's old mare, Sunshine, for Mary to ride. The horses seemed to sense the significance of the evening, dancing nervously as their riders mounted and set off across the desert toward the distant mesa. The ride to Devil's Table took them through terrain that Sam knew well, but tonight everything seemed different. Shadows moved in ways that didn't match the position of the setting sun, and sounds carried on the desert wind that had no earthly source. More than once, Sam thought he glimpsed figures moving parallel to their path, keeping pace with them but staying just out of clear sight. "Do you see them too?" Mary asked quietly, confirming that Sam wasn't imagining the mysterious presences. "I see them," Sam replied, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "But I don't think they're here to hurt us. They feel more like escorts." As they drew closer to Devil's Table, the feeling of being accompanied by unseen guardians grew stronger. Sam began to understand that they were traveling through territory where the normal rules of the physical world didn't necessarily apply. The markings on Mary's face were glowing softly now, and Sam could feel a strange tingling sensation on his own skin, as if invisible symbols were being drawn there by gentle, incorporeal fingers. Devil's Table rose before them like a natural fortress, its flat top silhouetted against the deepening purple of the evening sky. At its base, they could see the warm glow of a fire where Ayana and her daughters waited. As Sam and Mary approached, they could see that the Apache women had prepared an elaborate ceremonial circle marked by stones, feathers, and symbols drawn in the sand. "Welcome," Ayana called out as they dismounted. "You arrive at the perfect time. The barriers between worlds are already beginning to thin." Kaya and Senna stepped forward to greet them, and Sam was struck by how different the two young women looked from when he had first met them. Their markings were more elaborate now, covering not just their faces but their arms and hands as well.
They moved with a grace and purpose that spoke of deep spiritual training, and their eyes held a wisdom that seemed far beyond their years. "The entity has sensed our preparations," Senna told them, her voice carrying a note of warning. "It has been growing stronger throughout the day, feeding on the fear of the people in Copper Creek. We must complete the ceremony before it becomes powerful enough to break free from the spiritual realm entirely." Ayana led them to the ceremonial circle, explaining the significance of each element as they walked. The stones represent the 4 directions and the elements they guard. The feathers carry our prayers to the sky spirits. The symbols bind all these forces together, creating a protected space where we can work. At the center of the circle was a small fire pit surrounded by 4 larger stones. Each stone bore intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change in the flickering firelight. Beside the fire pit lay the items they would need for the ceremony: the knife Ayana had given to Sam, the obsidian mirror for Mary, and several bundles of herbs that would be burned to create sacred smoke. "Before we begin," Ayana said, "you must understand that once we step into the circle, there will be no turning back. The entity will know what we are doing and will try to stop us. It may attack us directly, or it may try to confuse us with illusions designed to break our concentration." She looked directly at Sam and Mary. "No matter what you see or hear during the ceremony, no matter how real it seems, you must remember that your only reality is this circle and the people standing in it with you. Trust in the markings that protect you and the strength of your own pure intentions." As the last light of day faded from the western sky, the 5 participants took their positions around the fire pit. Ayana began to chant in the Apache language, her voice rising and falling in ancient rhythms that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the mesa. Kaya and Senna joined their voices to hers, creating harmonies that made Sam's skin tingle with energy. Mary began to hum softly, finding her own harmony within the Apache chant even though she didn't understand the words. Sam felt his own voice being drawn into the song, adding a deep bass note that seemed to anchor the other voices and give them additional power. As their voices blended together, the markings on all their faces began to glow more brightly. The symbols in the sand around the circle started to shine with their own inner light, creating a barrier of spiritual energy that separated them from the ordinary world. For several minutes, the ceremony proceeded peacefully. The sacred herbs were burned, sending fragrant smoke spiraling up into the star-filled sky. Sam made his blood sacrifice, allowing a few drops to fall from a small cut on his palm onto the sacred stones. Mary raised the obsidian mirror, preparing to shatter it at the climactic moment of the ritual. But, as Ayana began the final phase of the ceremony, calling upon the ancient powers to banish the darkness back to its realm, the temperature around the circle suddenly dropped by 20 degrees. The stars overhead seemed to dim, and a wind began to blow from no particular direction, carrying with it the stench of decay and despair. "It comes," Ayana said grimly, her voice barely audible over the rising wind. "Stay strong. Remember who you are and why you are here." The darkness that had been lurking at the edges of their vision suddenly rushed toward the circle like a living thing. But, instead of crashing against their protective barrier, it began to take shape, coalescing into a form that was part shadow, part substance, and entirely malevolent. The entity that materialized before them was unlike anything from the natural world. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, with elongated limbs that ended in claws designed for tearing both flesh and spirit. Its face was a shifting mass of features that seemed to be composed of the worst fears and deepest despairs of everyone it had ever touched. When it spoke, its voice was like the sound of hope dying. "You think your pitiful marks and foolish songs can send me back to the darkness?" it hissed, circling their protective barrier like a predator looking for weakness. "I have tasted the despair of your people, and it has made me strong beyond your comprehension." The entity raised one clawed hand, and, suddenly, the air around the circle filled with visions designed to break their concentration. Sam saw images of his ranch burning, of Mary lying dead with her throat torn out. Mary saw herself alone and abandoned, watching helplessly as everyone she cared about walked away from her forever. But the markings on their faces flared brighter, burning away the false visions before they could take hold. The Apache chant continued, growing stronger and more defiant with each passing moment. "Your illusions have no power here," Ayana called out to the creature. "This circle is protected by forces older than your hunger, stronger than your malice. The entity's response was a roar of rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mesa. It began to circle the barrier faster, looking for any crack or weakness that would allow it to break through and tear apart the people who dared to challenge its power. As it moved, Sam could see that the creature was not just a spiritual entity. The physical form it had taken was solid and dangerous, with claws and teeth capable of doing real damage. If their protective circle failed, they would be facing not just a battle for their souls, but a fight for their lives.
"Now, Mary!" Ayana shouted over the creature's roaring. "Break the mirror! Shatter the illusions that give it form!"
Mary raised the obsidian circle above her head, and, for a moment, Sam could see their entire situation reflected in its dark surface. He saw the five of them standing together in their circle of light, surrounded by a darkness that sought to consume not just them, but everything they cared about. He saw the entity in its true form, not the terrible creature that stalked around their barrier, but a writhing mass of pure negativity that fed on human suffering. With a cry that combined determination and defiance, Mary brought the obsidian mirror down against the stones at her feet. The glass shattered with a sound like thunder, and immediately the entity's form began to waver and lose cohesion. "No," the creature shrieked, its voice becoming fainter as its physical form started to dissolve. "I will not be banished by mere mortals. I will tear your souls from your bodies and feast on them for eternity." But, even as it threatened them, the entity was being pulled back toward the spiritual realm from which it had emerged. The combined power of the ceremony, the protective markings, and the sacrifices they had made was proving stronger than its hunger for human suffering. Ayana began the banishment chant, her voice rising above the wind and the creature's screams. Kaya and Senna joined her, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to create visible threads of light that wrapped around the dissolving entity like chains. Sam and Mary added their own voices to the chant, not understanding the words but feeling their power flowing through them. The markings on Mary's face were blazing like small suns now, and Sam could feel similar symbols burning themselves into his own skin, marking him permanently as someone who had stood against the darkness and emerged victorious. As the final words of the banishment were spoken, the entity let out one last roar of defeated rage before being sucked back into the spiritual void where it belonged. The darkness that had surrounded them lifted like fog before the morning sun, and the stars overhead seemed to shine with renewed brilliance. The silence that followed was profound and peaceful. The five participants stood in their circle, breathing heavily but triumphant, knowing that they had succeeded in their impossible task. But, as Sam looked around at his companions, he noticed that something was changing. Just as Ayana had warned, the markings on the Apache women's faces were beginning to fade. The symbols that had given them their power and protected them throughout the ceremony were dissolving like writing in sand before the tide. "It is done," Ayana said softly, touching her face where the elaborate spirals and geometric patterns were growing fainter by the moment. "The darkness has been banished, and the balance has been restored." Kaya and Senna embraced their mother, and Sam could see tears glistening in their eyes as they watched their spiritual markings disappear. They were sacrificing their supernatural abilities to save people they had never met, giving up a fundamental part of their identity for the greater good. But, when Sam looked at Mary, he was surprised to see that her markings were not fading. If anything, they seemed to be growing more permanent, as if they were becoming a natural part of her skin. "Why aren't Mary's markings disappearing?" he asked Ayana. The Apache woman smiled, though her expression was tinged with sadness at the loss of her own spiritual sight. "Because her sacrifice was different from ours. We gave up our power to banish the darkness. She gave up her old life to become something new, a guardian who will watch for signs of returning darkness and stand ready to face it if it ever threatens this land again." Sam felt his heart swell with pride and concern for his sister. "What does that mean for her future?" "It means that Mary Harrison is no longer just a rancher's daughter," Ayana explained. "The spirits have marked her as one of their own. She will have abilities that ordinary people do not possess, the ability to see threats before they fully manifest, to communicate with the spirit world when necessary, and to serve as a bridge between your people and mine." Mary touched her face where the markings continued to glow softly. "I can feel it," she said wonderingly. "I can sense the spiritual energy of this place, see the threads that connect all living things. It's beautiful and terrifying at the same time." As they began to dismantle the ceremonial circle and prepare for the journey back to their respective homes, Sam found himself thinking about what Ayanna had told him earlier, that by participating in the ceremony, he was changing his destiny forever. The entity was gone, the immediate threat had been neutralized, but he suspected that their adventures together were far from over. The ride back to the ranch was quiet and contemplative. Sam and Mary traveled in comfortable silence, each processing the enormity of what they had experienced. The desert around them seemed peaceful again, free from the oppressive presence that had been building for weeks. As they approached their home, Sam noticed that the air itself felt cleaner, as if a poisonous fog had been lifted from the entire region. The familiar landmarks of their ranch looked exactly the same as they had that morning, but somehow everything felt different, lighter, more alive, more hopeful. "Sam," Mary said as they unsaddled their horses, "I want you to know that no matter what happens next, no matter how my life changes because of these markings, I'm grateful that we did this together." Sam pulled his sister into a tight embrace, feeling the warmth of the spiritual symbols against his cheek. "We're family, Mary. Whatever comes next, we'll face it the same way we faced tonight, together." As they walked toward their house, Sam caught sight of their neighbor riding hard across the desert from the direction of Copper Creek. The man looked excited rather than alarmed, and, when he reached the ranch, he called out news that confirmed the success of their mission. "Sam! Mary," he shouted. "Have you heard? The strangest thing happened in Copper Creek tonight. All the people who've been sick with that melancholy just suddenly got better. Doc Patterson says it's like a miracle, folks who haven't spoken in weeks are laughing and talking again." Sam and Mary exchanged knowing looks, their hearts filled with the satisfaction that comes from a job well done. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, but, more than that, they had helped save an entire community from a fate worse than death. As the neighbor rode away to spread the good news, Sam and Mary stood together in their yard, looking up at the stars that seemed to shine with special brightness over their little corner of the desert. The markings on Mary's face caught the starlight, reminding them both that their lives had been forever changed by their encounter with forces beyond the ordinary world. But change, Sam reflected, was not necessarily something to fear. Sometimes it was exactly what was needed to help good people find the courage to do extraordinary things. 3 weeks had passed since the ceremony at Devil's Table, and life at the Harrison Ranch had settled into a new rhythm. The cattle were thriving, the autumn roundup had been completed successfully, and the desert seemed to hum with renewed vitality. But, beneath the surface of this apparent normalcy, profound changes were taking place that would reshape not just Sam and Mary's lives, but the entire relationship between the white settlers and the Apache people of the region. Mary's transformation had been the most dramatic and visible. The spiritual markings on her face had not faded as expected, but instead had evolved into something that looked almost like natural skin pigmentation, beautiful and distinctive, but not obviously supernatural to casual observers. More significantly, the abilities Ayanna had mentioned were manifesting in ways that both amazed and sometimes frightened her. She could sense the emotional state of animals from great distances, often knowing when cattle were in distress or predators were approaching long before any visible signs appeared. Her dreams were filled with visions of events that were happening hundreds of miles away, and she had begun to understand fragments of various Native American languages without any formal instruction. Most remarkably, she had developed an ability to communicate with the spirits that Ayanna claimed watched over the desert. These conversations happened during her evening meditations, when she would sit in their mother's garden and listen to voices that spoke in whispers carried on the desert wind. Sam, meanwhile, found that his own connection to the spiritual realm was less dramatic but no less significant. He could sense danger approaching the ranch hours before it arrived, and his understanding of the natural rhythms of the desert had deepened to an almost mystical level. The horses and cattle responded to him with a trust and obedience that went beyond normal animal training, as if they recognized something in him that marked him as a protector. On this particular morning, Sam was repairing fence near the eastern boundary of their property when he noticed a dust cloud approaching from the direction of Copper Creek. As the rider drew closer, he recognized Sheriff Tom Bradley, a decent man who had always treated the Harrison family with respect despite some of the more unsavory elements in town who resented their peaceful relationship with the local Apache bands. "Morning, Sam," Bradley called out as he reined in his horse beside the fence line. "Mind if I water my horse and have a word with you?" "Of course, Sheriff," Sam replied, setting down his tools and walking over to meet the lawman.
"What brings you out our way?" Bradley dismounted and led his horse to the water trough before answering.
The sheriff was a man in his mid-50s, with graying hair and weathered features that spoke of a lifetime spent in the desert sun. His expression was serious, but Sam could see that whatever was troubling him wasn't directed at the Harrison family. "Sam, I need to ask you about something that's been happening in town," Bradley said, removing his hat and wiping the sweat from his forehead.
"You know how folks have been recovering from that strange melancholy that was affecting so many people?" Sam nodded carefully. "I heard things were getting better."
"Better is putting it mildly," Bradley continued.
"It's like a miracle happened overnight.
People who hadn't spoken in weeks are suddenly back to their old selves. Families that were falling apart are reconciling. Even the town drunk has sworn off liquor and is talking about starting fresh."
The sheriff paused, studying Sam's face carefully.
"But here's the thing that's got me puzzled. Several people have mentioned having dreams about Apache women with painted faces, dreams where these women were performing some kind of ceremony to drive away evil spirits. And more than one person has specifically mentioned seeing you and Mary in these dreams, standing with the Apache women in some kind of ritual circle." Sam felt his heart rate increase, but he kept his expression neutral.
"Dreams can be pretty strange things, Sheriff.
Folks have been under a lot of stress lately."
Bradley nodded slowly.
"That's what I figured at first. But then, I started hearing stories from some of the Apache people who trade in town. They're saying that a group of medicine women came through the area a few weeks ago, women with markings they'd never seen before who were said to have special powers for fighting spiritual darkness." The sheriff put his hat back on and looked directly into Sam's eyes.
"Sam, I'm not asking you to confirm or deny anything specific.
But if you know something about what happened to heal our town, I want you to know that there are a lot of grateful people in Copper Creek. Whatever happened, whoever was responsible, they have the thanks of an entire community."
Sam considered his response carefully.
Bradley was a good man, but he was also a representative of a legal system that didn't always understand or tolerate the spiritual practices of the Apache people.
"Sheriff, all I can tell you is that there are forces in this desert that most white folks don't understand.
Sometimes those forces work through people who are willing to stand up for what's right, regardless of the color of their skin or the customs they follow." Bradley smiled for the first time since arriving at the ranch.
"That's about what I expected you to say, and it's good enough for me.
But there's something else I need to discuss with you, something that could affect you and Mary directly." The sheriff's expression grew serious again. "Word has gotten out about the healing in Copper Creek, and about the dreams people have been having. Some of the more religious folks in town are claiming it was a miracle from God, while others are saying it was witchcraft that should be investigated and punished."
Sam felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of investigation?"
"Nothing official yet," Bradley assured him quickly. "But there's a territorial judge named Cornelius Hayes who's been making a circuit through the small towns, looking for cases involving what he calls unnatural influences on Christian communities. He's got some kind of mandate from the territorial government to investigate reports of witchcraft, Indian magic, and other practices that supposedly threaten the moral fiber of white settlements." Bradley's voice carried a note of disgust as he continued. "Hayes is the kind of man who sees devils hiding behind every bush and thinks the only good Indian is a dead Indian. If he decides to investigate what happened in Copper Creek, he's going to be looking for scapegoats, and anyone who's had friendly relations with the Apache people is going to be suspect." Sam thought about Mary's markings and her newfound abilities. If a judge with a bias against Native American spiritual practices came to investigate, she would be in serious danger.
"What are you suggesting we do, Sheriff?"
"I'm suggesting that you and Mary might want to consider taking a trip for a while," Bradley said.
"Maybe visit some relatives in another territory until Hayes moves on to his next crusade."
"I can't protect you from a territorial judge if he decides you're guilty of something, even if that something is just being decent to your Apache neighbors." Before Sam could respond, they both heard the sound of approaching horses from the direction of the ranch house. Looking up, Sam saw Mary riding toward them with 3 Apache riders. Even from a distance, he could recognize Ayanna and her daughters, though they looked different without their spiritual markings. "Well," Bradley said quietly, "I guess that answers any questions I might have had about your connections to the local Apache community." As the group approached, Sam noticed that Ayanna looked troubled. The loss of her spiritual markings had aged her, making her appear more like an ordinary middle-aged woman rather than the powerful medicine woman he had first met. But her eyes still held intelligence and determination, and the way she carried herself suggested that she had not lost her sense of purpose despite losing her supernatural abilities. "Sam Harrison," Ayanna called out as she dismounted, "we need to speak with you and your sister about an urgent matter." Mary dismounted as well, and Sam could see that the markings on her face were glowing slightly, responding to some kind of spiritual disturbance. "There's trouble coming," she said simply. "The spirits have been warning me all morning." Sheriff Bradley looked back and forth between the Apache women and the Harrison siblings, clearly trying to decide how to handle a situation that was rapidly moving beyond his understanding. Finally, he settled on the practical approach that had served him well throughout his career. "Sam, I'm going to head back to town," he said, mounting his horse. "As far as I'm concerned, I came out here to check on your fence repair and found everything normal and peaceful. But, if I were you, I'd give serious thought to what I said about taking a trip." After the sheriff rode away, Ayanna got straight to the point. "The entity we banished 3 weeks ago was not working alone. It was part of a larger network of spiritual parasites that have been released from various sacred sites across the territory. Our ceremony succeeded in driving away the one that threatened Copper Creek, but it also sent a signal to the others, alerting them to our presence." Kaya added, "We have been contacted by medicine people from other tribes, Navajo, Hopi, even some from as far away as the Lakota lands. They report similar outbreaks of spiritual darkness in their regions, and they believe the entities are being deliberately released by people who seek to profit from the chaos they create." "What kind of people would do something like that?" Mary asked, her markings pulsing with agitation. Senna answered, "Men who believe that if they can drive the Indian tribes to madness and despair, they can claim our lands without having to fight for them. Men who think that spiritual weapons are more effective than bullets because they leave no evidence that white courts would recognize." Sam felt anger rising in his chest. "You're saying there's a conspiracy to use supernatural attacks to drive Native Americans from their lands?" Ayanna nodded grimly. "And those who help us fight back are marked as enemies of this conspiracy. The spirits have shown us visions of men in dark suits who speak of cleansing the territory of Indian influences and the white people who enable them." Mary's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Judge Hayes. Sheriff Bradley just warned us about a territorial judge who investigates unnatural influences in white communities. He's coming here, isn't he?" "Within the week," Ayanna confirmed. "But he will not come alone, and his investigation will be a pretense for something much worse. The visions show us that he plans to use any evidence of cooperation between white settlers and Apache people as justification for forcing relocations and seizing land." Sam looked at his sister, seeing his own determination reflected in her marked face. "What do you need us to do?" Kaya stepped forward. "There is a gathering being planned, a great council of medicine people from many tribes. They will attempt a ceremony large enough to cleanse all the spiritual contamination at once and bind the dark entities permanently. But such a ceremony requires participants from the white world as well, people who have proven they can stand between the worlds and maintain the balance." "Where and when?" Mary asked without hesitation. "The sacred canyon of the ancients, 2 days' ride north of here," Ayanna replied. "But to reach it, we will have to pass through territory that is being watched by Hayes's men. They are looking for any excuse to arrest Apache people or their white allies." Senna added, "And even if we reach the canyon safely, the ceremony itself will be more dangerous than what we faced at Devil's Table. We will be confronting not just one entity, but the combined power of all the spiritual parasites that have been released across the territory." Sam thought about Sheriff Bradley's warning and the danger that Mary would face if they stayed at the ranch to be investigated by Judge Hayes. He thought about the conspiracy that was using supernatural weapons to drive innocent people from their homes. Most of all, he thought about the responsibility that came with the abilities they had been given.
When do we leave? He asked.
Ayana smiled, the expression transforming her face despite the absence of her spiritual markings.
Tonight, under cover of darkness.
We will travel by hidden paths known only to the Apache people, and we will move quickly to reach the canyon before Hayes and his men realize we are gone. Mary placed her hand on Sam's shoulder, her markings pulsing with renewed energy.
Are you sure about this, brother? We'll be leaving everything we know behind, and there's no guarantee we'll be coming back.
Sam looked around at the ranch that had been his family's home for 20 years, at the familiar landscape that held so many memories of their parents and their childhood together. Then, he looked at the Apache women who had trusted them enough to include them in something that could change the fate of an entire region.
Mary, do you remember what Papa used to say about the difference between a house and a home?
Mary smiled, remembering their father's words. He said a house is just a building, but a home is anywhere you're surrounded by people who care about doing the right thing. That's right, Sam said, feeling peace settle over him despite the magnitude of what they were about to undertake. And I think we're about to find out that home can be a lot bigger than we ever imagined. As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, the Harrison siblings began preparing for a journey that would take them far from the safety of their ranch and into a conflict that would test everything they had learned about courage, sacrifice, and the bonds that connect all living things. The desert wind carried the sound of distant drums, calling them toward an adventure that would determine not just their own futures, but the spiritual health of an entire territory. And, somewhere in that wind, Sam thought he could hear the voices of his parents, telling him that they were proud of the people their children had become. Tonight, they would ride toward the unknown, trusting in the markings that protected Mary and the wisdom they had gained from standing against the darkness. Tomorrow, they would discover whether the bonds they had forged with the Apache people were strong enough to overcome the forces that sought to tear apart the delicate balance between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits. The sacred canyon stretched before them like a wound in the earth, its red rock walls rising hundreds of feet toward a sky that seemed darker than it should be for midday. Ancient petroglyphs covered the stone surfaces, telling stories of ceremonies and gatherings that had taken place in this hidden valley for thousands of years. But, today, the canyon held more than just the echoes of the past. Representatives from dozens of tribes had gathered in response to the call for a great cleansing ceremony. Navajo medicine men sat beside Hopi elders, while Lakota shamans shared stories with Apache wise women. The diversity of the gathering was unprecedented, bringing together people who might normally have little contact with each other but who recognized the magnitude of the threat they were facing. Sam and Mary had arrived with Ayana and her daughters just as the sun reached its zenith, after 2 days of hard travel through hidden desert paths. The journey had been harrowing, with constant vigilance required to avoid the patrols of Judge Hayes's men who were scouring the territory for signs of suspicious activity. But they had made it safely to the canyon, and now they stood at the edge of a ceremonial circle that dwarfed anything Sam had previously imagined. Hundreds of participants were arranged in concentric rings around a central fire pit that had been burning continuously for 3 days. The smoke from sacred herbs and offerings rose in a straight column toward the sky, carrying prayers and intentions upward to whatever powers governed the balance between worlds. "I have never seen anything like this," Mary whispered to Sam as they took their places in the outer ring of participants. The markings on her face were responding to the spiritual energy of the gathering, glowing so brightly that they looked like veins of gold beneath her skin. Sam nodded, equally awed by the scope of what they were witnessing. The combined spiritual power of so many medicine people was almost overwhelming, creating an atmosphere that seemed to vibrate with invisible energy. He could feel the hair on his arms standing up, and his skin tingled as if electricity was dancing across its surface. At the center of the gathering, an ancient Hopi elder named Masawo stepped forward to address the assembled participants. Despite his advanced age, his voice carried clearly across the canyon as he spoke in a mixture of languages, ensuring that everyone could understand at least some of what he was saying. "Brothers and sisters of many peoples," he began, "we have gathered here because the spiritual balance of our world has been deliberately disturbed by those who seek to profit from chaos and suffering. The entities that have been released from their ancient prisons feed on despair and violence, growing stronger with each soul they corrupt." He paused, looking around the circle at faces that represented dozens of different tribes and traditions. "But we have also gathered because the spirits themselves have called upon us to act.
They have shown us that this darkness can be defeated, but only if we work together with hearts united in purpose. A Navajo medicine woman named Diezba stood up from her place in the second ring. The entities are not scattered randomly across the territory, she announced. Our scouts have discovered that they are being controlled from a central location, coordinated by men who believe they can use spiritual weapons without suffering spiritual consequences. She pointed toward the eastern rim of the canyon. Judge Cornelius Hayes and his followers have established a camp in the hills above us. They believe they are hunting down practitioners of witchcraft, but they are actually serving as guardians for the master entity that controls all the others. Sam felt his blood run cold. You mean they're here? Now. Ayana, who had been sitting quietly since their arrival, spoke up for the first time. They have been following us, just as we suspected they would. But their presence here may actually work in our favor. The Great Cleansing Ceremony requires that we confront the source of the darkness directly, and Hayes has brought that source to us. An elderly Lakota shaman named Chayton rose from his position near the central fire. The spirits have shown us what must be done. The cleansing ceremony will create a spiritual vortex powerful enough to banish all the entities back to their realm, but someone must go to the source of their power and break the physical anchors that keep them tied to our world. Mary's markings pulsed urgently. What kind of physical anchors? Chayton's expression was grim. Sacred objects that were stolen from various tribal burial sites and ceremonial locations. Hayes and his conspirators have gathered these artifacts together, using them to create a network of spiritual corruption that spans the entire territory. Kaya, who had been listening intently to the exchange, stood up from her place beside her mother. The visions show us that these artifacts are being kept in Hayes's camp, guarded by men who have no idea what they are truly protecting. To break the network, someone must enter the camp and destroy or reclaim these sacred objects. Sam looked around the circle at hundreds of medicine people preparing for a ceremony that could determine the spiritual fate of the entire region. The thought of leaving this place of power and safety to infiltrate an enemy camp seemed like suicide, but he could see from the expressions on the faces around him that it was exactly what was being asked of them. Who would undertake such a mission, he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Masawa's ancient eyes fixed on Sam and Mary. The spirits have marked you both as bridges between the white world and the world of the tribes. You can move through Hayes's camp without immediately arousing suspicion, and your connection to the spiritual realm will allow you to identify the stolen artifacts. Diezba added, but you will not go alone. Kaya and Senna will accompany you, along with warriors from several tribes who have volunteered for this mission. The ceremony will begin at sunset, giving you several hours to reach Hayes's camp and complete your task. Mary touched the markings on her face, feeling their energy pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. What exactly do we need to do once we find these artifacts? Ayana stood up and walked to the center of the circle, where she removed a small leather pouch from around her neck. This contains sacred earth from the burial ground where the original binding ceremonies took place. If you can sprinkle even a small amount of this earth on each stolen artifact while speaking the words of return, the spiritual connections that anchor the entities will be broken. She handed the pouch to Mary, their fingers touching for a moment as the transfer was made. Sam noticed that where their skin made contact, both women's markings flared briefly, as if acknowledging the passage of some essential power. But, be warned, Chayton said solemnly. The moment you begin the ritual of return, the master entity will know what you are doing. It will send everything it has to stop you, including turning Hayes and his men into vessels for its rage. The magnitude of what they were being asked to do settled over Sam like a heavy blanket. They would be walking into a camp full of armed men who were already hostile to Apache people and their allies, then performing a ritual that would make them targets for supernatural attack as well. But, as he looked around the circle at the hundreds of people who were preparing to risk everything to heal the spiritual wounds of their land, Sam felt the same sense of rightness that had guided him since this adventure began. These were good people fighting against forces that sought to destroy not just their way of life, but their very souls. When do we leave? He asked. The mission began 2 hours before sunset, giving them time to reach Hayes's camp and locate the stolen artifacts before the cleansing ceremony commenced. Sam and Mary rode with a strike force that included Kaya, Senna,
and 6 Apache warriors who had volunteered to help create a distraction while the Harrison siblings infiltrated the camp itself. The ride to the hills above the canyon was tense and silent, with everyone focused on the dangerous task ahead. But, as they crested the final ridge and got their first look at Hayes's encampment, Sam felt his anger flare at what he saw below. The judge had turned his temporary base into something that looked more like a military fortress than a judicial investigation site. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, and Sam could see what appeared to be a makeshift prison where several Apache people were being held in chains. But, most disturbing of all was the large tent at the center of the camp, from which emanated a spiritual darkness so intense that even Sam could feel it pressing against his consciousness. "The artifacts are in that tent," Mary whispered, her markings responding to the negative energy radiating from the camp. "I can feel them calling out, begging to be returned to their proper resting places." Kaya pointed to a cluster of rocks on the eastern side of the camp. "We will create our distraction there. When you hear the sound of gunfire, that will be your signal to move toward the central tent. You will have perhaps 10 minutes before they organize a proper response." Senna handed Sam a small bag of what looked like ordinary sand. "Throw this into any fire you see in the camp. It will create smoke that will make it difficult for them to see clearly, giving you additional cover." Sam pocketed the sand and checked his revolver, though he hoped he wouldn't need to use it. The plan was to get in, perform the ritual, and get out without engaging in unnecessary violence. But he was prepared to defend.